Good morning, everybody. Thanks for rejoining us here at the Modern Challenges to the Extraterrestrial Hypothesis Conference. We're in Roswell, New Mexico, celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Roswell UFO crash, also known as the Roswell incident. And if you're joining us on the web, by the way, shout out to South Africa, UK, Australia. I'm amazed at the response this has gotten for you. I want to give you a little heads up. We're having some tech issues early on a Sunday morning with the cable company broadcasting, so this is not normally. What you're going to see is PowerPoints behind. What you have seen already is PowerPoints intermingled, where you get better resolution. We have recorded this once already, and you can always watch it in the archive. But we're going live. I just want to give you a little different heads up. Good morning, Nick.
How you doing?
Thanks for coming back here. It's really neat. Nick and I shared the front page of the Roswell Daily Record the other day from doing presentations earlier this week. They were good to us. They were really good to us. We appreciate that. But Nick has been, he's well known in the field of cryptozoology, UFO research. He hails from the United Kingdom originally. He's the author of over 40 books, beginning with UFO files, cosmic crashes, everything out of the UK, and he's lived in America now. He lives in Texas. A very prolific author, and he has made a habit. The two things he's known for, one are digging up government files through the Freedom of Information Act, bringing new information to the public's light. And in the process of doing that, as you'll find out, he's been contacted by many people who have something that they want to share. And that's part of how the story is going to tell about the Roswell incident. Like many of us here at the Modern Challenges to the Extraterrestrial Conference, or to the Extraterrestrial Hypothesis, he thinks there may be something different going on, whether it's UFOs and aliens in general, abductions and stuff like that. But his research has led him to a government program that, like many of us here have also found in various forms of research, lend itself to a man-made explanation that is probably more shocking to the world and to America for sure, than an alien explanation for the Roswell incident. So you may know a little bit about what he's going to present, but he's going to come up and do a new talk based on his newest book, which is the sequel to Body Snatchers in the Desert, The Horrible Truth of the Roswell Incident. And the new one is on Roswell itself 10 years later, his research that he's adding to it. So I'll let him tell you more. Thank you again for joining us live on the internet, archive, wherever you are. Come on up, Nick. Thanks.
Thanks everybody. As Guy said, this is sort of the alternative to the other conferences that are going on in town. And by alternative, we're not talking about debunking or anything like that. We're just looking at other scenarios and ideas that might explain aspects of the UFO subject in general and the Roswell case in particular. Now, of course, Roswell is within ufology, it's the #1 case that many people sort of really put all their eggs in one basket and have all their hopes on this one case, which is going to resolve the truth of the UFO phenomenon. And that could well happen. I don't fully dismiss the idea that aliens could really have crashed at Roswell. I don't dispute that possibility. But when you look into the history of what was going on in that particular time and the geographical areas, there are other examples and other theories and ideas that may go some way towards explaining the phenomenon in a different way. And whenever I do this lecture, I always point out to people that, I'm not a UFO skeptic, I'm not a UFO debunker. I'm actually a full-on believer in the UFO phenomenon. And over the years, there have been thousands, and literally thousands and thousands of UFO incidents. But I'm just not sure if this one case, Roswell, is part of the UFO phenomenon, or it's been assumed and presumed to be part of the phenomenon. And I'll give you a little bit of background as to how and why I got interested in the UFO subject, and also how and why I am a believer in the UFO phenomenon. My dad was in the British Royal Air Force. He was a radar mechanic. And he was involved in several UFO incidents in the early 1950s. At the time, he was stationed at the Royal Air Force Base. And the British Royal Air Force is the equivalent of the US Air Force over here. And He was, as I said, a radar mechanic, and in the early 50s he was involved in several UFO encounters, and the military base that he was stationed at the time was called Royal Air Force Neatishead. It was on the east coast of England, which sort of borders Europe, and just beyond Europe you have Russia. So, in other words, the bases, which all ran down the east coast of England, were strategic installations which, if the Russians ever launched a sneak attack, the East Coast military installations would be the first wave to respond. And in the early hours of one particular morning in September 52, the radar operators at the base tracked these strange, high-flying, fast-moving objects approaching the British coastline. Now, they were performing all sorts of weird manoeuvres, like travelling 500 or 600 miles an hour and then coming to a complete stop, which is impossible for an aircraft. You would just be killed by the G-forces in the plane. We just don't have the technology to fly an aircraft of any type at all. But when it's travelling 500, 600, 700 miles an hour, you have to physically slow the plane down. You cannot suddenly come to a sudden halt. But that's what was going on with these aircraft, or UFOs, or whatever they were. And even though they were performing these strange manoeuvres, the first thought was, well, it's got to be the Russians. What else could it be? So fighter planes were sent into the sky from a nearby base. As the pilots closed in on them, several of them reported seeing classic flying saucer type craft. Others reported seeing these large balls of light. One of the pilots described it, imagine if you had sort of like a camera flash, that intensity, but it didn't go off. It was just that brilliance and stayed like that. That was essentially the situation. This went on for 3 nights, and again the planes were sent up and the UFOs just ran rings around them and vanished as mysteriously as they first appeared. So after the 3rd night of the encounters, everybody who was involved, which was like my dad on the radar mechanics side, the radar operators, the pilots, the ground crew, everybody involved was told, you won't talk about this. And everybody was reminded that they signed the British government's Official Secrets Act. And the Official Secrets Act is a piece of documentation where if you join the military or the government and you're exposed to government secrets, then if you break the oath of the Official Secrets Act, you can be prosecuted, and depending on the variations of the level of secrecy involved, you could be thrown out of the military, or you could be fined, or you could be imprisoned. And so everybody was reminded that they signed the OSA. And as I said, this was the early 50s. My dad didn't tell anybody. He told me for the first time when I was about 11 or 12. And that's sort of what got me interested in the subject. And not just because it was my own father, but also because he was in the military and worked on radar as a mechanic. And so that sort of led me to read more on the subject. And then when I finished school, I began working on a music magazine back in England called Zero, and I did that a few years. And then I thought, well, why not try and combine the interest with the UFO subject with an investigative journalistic approach to looking into the UFO subject, which is what I've always tried to do. In other words, to uncover the facts that are available and present them to people like yourself, where I'm just sharing the data that's been uncovered, because I don't feel it's the right approach to take, that I stand here, lecturing at you and telling you what to believe, because that would be irresponsible. Because I always tell people to remember that when it comes to UFOs, the U still stands for unidentified. We don't really know what this phenomenon is, and that's why it's good that guys putting on this particular conference, looking at the different ideas beyond just the extraterrestrial angle, such as time travel, interdimensional, paranormal, supernatural, man-made aircraft. And I think it's not just one thing. I think the UFO phenomenon, it's not sort of black and white that it's this or that. There could actually be multiple explanations for different aspects of the UFO phenomenon. So before I get to this sort of alternative theory for what may have happened at Roswell, I'll give you a bit of background on the case itself for people who may not know the full story. If the clicker will work.
Philip, you got to exit out of the other computer and just give
What's
it.
that?
There you go.
Now, over the years, various places in and around Roswell have been suggested as the impact site, or one of the impact sites where the UFO or whatever it was came down. And certainly between here and Lincoln County, where the object came down, there have been sort of 4 or 5 different places put forward for where wreckage or a semi-intact craft or strange-looking bodies were found. But that is the one site that we know for sure was the main site itself. And that's what used to be called the Foster Ranch, located in Lincoln County. And the reason why I've included that photograph as it is because that stretch there, where you can see the mountains in the background, but from here, fanning out this way, that is the actual crash site where all this strange foil-like debris and wreckage was found. And the man who found it was a rancher named William Brazel, known to all his friends as Mac. And he woke up one morning, went out to tend the ranch and the animals. This was in early July 1947. There's actually some dispute as to when the Roswell crash actually occurred. It may have been on July the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, but it was around that time. And he went out into the field, he was going to go to tend to the sheep, and he came across this huge field of wreckage. That's the only way you can describe it, sort of, as I said, fanning out in kind of like a cone fashion. It was literally right into the distance, and it was estimated to be a couple of 100 feet wide and about 600 feet long in terms of whatever this strange material was. And he'd never seen anything like this before, although intriguingly, and this also ties in with the alternative angle for what Roswell might have been, 2 previous military devices had actually fallen on the ranch, both weather balloon type devices, and of the military. So that's kind of interesting, you know, that even prior to the UFO event, there'd been 2 military crashes, if you like, on the ranch. I think one was 45 and the other was 46. So he was well used to things coming down out of the sky onto the property. And that wasn't so strange because back then you had places like White Sands and Alamogordo where there was a lot of rocket testing going on and testing with new and alternative and unusual aircraft as well. And he had no idea what it was. But bear in mind, this was only sort of 10 days or possibly less since the first sighting of a UFO occurred. And this took place on June the 24th, 1947, over Mount Rainier in Washington State, and involved a pilot named Kenneth Arnold. And Kenneth Arnold was flying out near to Mount Rainier when he saw this squadron of strange-looking aircraft. And ironically, he didn't describe them as being flying saucer shaped. What he said was that it was sort of like a half moon, like a crescent type shape. But he said that if you imagine you took a saucer and you skipped it across like a lake or a river, and it would kind of bounce like that, he said that's how they flew. So it wasn't actually the shape of the UFO that created the term flying saucer. What happened was that when Kenneth Arnold landed, he told the local airport, and the media soon got onto the story, and they said, "Hey Kenneth, what do you think you saw?" He said, "Well, I don't know, but there were strange objects which looked like how you would skip a saucer across a body of water." And then one of the journalists came up with the term flying saucer. Now, bear in mind, this was only a little bit more than a week after the Kenneth Arnold sighting that the Roswell events happened. So in that week or so, nobody really knew much about flying saucers at all. You know, in the room today now, you know, we've got 70 years of history and stories and accounts to work with. And, you know, everything from crop circles, Area 51, UFO sightings, alien abductions, contact cases. You know, we've got massive amounts of material. Back then, just a week after Kenneth Arnold's sighting, nobody really knew what was happening. And there was no sort of real heavy influence in terms of people saying, oh, these are coming from Mars or Venus. You know, it was just strange things people were seeing in the sky. And Mac Brazel wondered what this material was, didn't know what it was, wasn't there the day before, and this was the following day, so whatever it was had clearly come down during the night. And so he spoke to a number of his nearby neighbours, and bear in mind the size of the ranches and the isolation out there. You know, his nearby neighbours were sort of a mile, half a mile, 2 miles away. And he invited them over to see this wreckage just strewn across the ground. And they said, well, Mac, you know, have you heard these stories on the radio about these things they're calling flying saucers? Maybe that's what this is, the remains of a flying saucer. Now, Roswell didn't have a telephone, so he drove to the local sheriff's office, told the sheriff, hey, you know, something has come down on the ranch, it's just wrecked everywhere. And so the sheriff then telephoned the staff at the Roswell military base. And they sent out Major Jesse Marcel, who's one of the most famous of all the people linked to the Roswell story. Marcel went out there, saw the foil, couldn't recognise it for whatever it might be, and he collected up as much as he could and put it into the back of the vehicle that he was driving. Now bear in mind that there was sort of 600 feet worth of material, obviously he couldn't collect it all. So he went back to the base with what they found, and then a second team of dozens and dozens of military personnel from the base were brought out. And there are stories of them sort of literally on their hands and knees in a line, crawling along, picking up every single bit and making sure absolutely nothing was left behind. Although there are stories of people who claim to have little pieces hidden away, etc., but nothing has really, you know, been defined as definitely coming from the crash itself. Now, in between Marcel, in between Marcel taking some of the wreckage back, the story is that Brazil found 2 other sites on the ranch which were obviously connected with this one. One of the sites was around about 2 miles away, and Brazil had one of his neighbours had a young son named Dean Proctor, and he liked to help out on the ranch. And Brazil and Dean Proctor were walking in one area, roughly 2 miles away from this site, as I said, but still part of the ranch and where the animals were grazing. And they stumbled across one or more small bodies. And of course, that really placed things in a completely different category. You know, this wasn't just the wreckage. There was another area, and there were bodies. There was a crew, or you know, there were people on board, or entities on board, however you want to term it. And this kind of really elevated things to another level. You know, those previous balloons that he'd found were just weather balloons, which obviously don't have crews on board, people on board, or anything. And they were sort of reportedly, you know, plunged into a state of fear when they saw these strange bodies. And what happened then was that 2 counterintelligence officers came out, one named Sheridan Cavett and the other one named Bill Rickett. And by all accounts, whichever side of the camp you're on when it comes to what happened at Roswell, just about everybody agrees that the 2 men, more than any other, who knew the secret of what happened at Roswell were Sheridan Cavett and Bill Rickett. They went out there and almost certainly saw the bodies, and then Brazil said to them, well, you know, there's not just a debris field, I need to show you something else. And they were like, well, what? And he said words to the effect of, well, really, you just better come out and see it for yourself. And that's when he showed them the bodies, which were, after a day or 2 in the summer sun in New Mexico, were already deteriorating, on top of the fact that they were sort of badly damaged from the accident itself. And then there was reportedly a 3rd site where there was a semi-intact vehicle, or at least larger portions of whatever this craft was. And again, the story is that everything was quickly collected and sent to the Roswell base, where there was sort of like an emergency operation to try and preserve the bodies as good as they could. And then from there, everything was reportedly flown to Wright Field, which today is called Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And there was a good reason why, and a logical reason why they did that, because Wright-Patterson was and still is home to what's called the Foreign Technology Division of the Air Force. Now, the Foreign Technology Division, as its name suggests, it deals with non-American materials that fall into the hands of the US military. You know, for example, if a Russian spy satellite, you know, circles the US and it malfunctions and crashed in, say, the Nevada desert, it would be, back then, it would have been taken to the to the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson. Today might go to somewhere like Area 51, we don't know, but certainly back then, Wright-Patterson was the hub for anything that landed on US soil that wasn't American, and which could be potentially sort of back-engineered and studied. And again, if it was something like a Russian device that came down, it would allow us to determine if the Russians were ahead of us or behind us in terms of various technologies. So that is the story of what happened. Now, in terms of the different theories that have been put forward for what happened or what didn't happen, there's actually no less than 12 different explanations circulating, and of course they can't all be correct. One of them obviously probably is correct. The others could be a combination of disinformation, misinformation, hoaxing, friend of a friend tales that got distorted. But beyond the UFO angle, the primary theories have come from the Air Force. Now, there are a lot of people in ufology who point the finger at the Air Force and give them a bad name. They say, oh, they're the bad guys, they're hiding all this. I actually don't believe that at all. I don't think the Air Force or the government are the bad guys. I don't think they're actually hiding what happened at Roswell. What I think is that somebody is hiding the truth. But if you read the Air Force's reports that they put out on Roswell, it's clear that even the Air Force could not, as strange as it sounds, the Air Force of 1994, when they did their Roswell investigation, they could not find the Roswell files. They couldn't find any kind of paperwork at all. And this suggests that whatever happened at Roswell is so highly classified that the group that oversees it and hides it is pretty much answerable to nobody. And that includes the Air Force, the Army, whoever. And this sort of comes to what's known as need to know. And in other words, if you need to know something, you're told about it. If you don't need to know about it, you're not told about it. And that's how secrets are kept. But in 1947, what happened was the Air Force announced we've recovered a flying saucer on the ranch, on this particular ranch in Lincoln County. And the next day that was changed, and sorry, it was just a weather balloon, nothing to see, everybody go home and forget about it. And that's what did happen. The case just fell into obscurity until the 1970s, when Stan Friedman and Bill Moore, who co-wrote with Charles Billings the Roswell Incident book, which came out in 1980. Between 47 and around about 75, 76, nothing at all hardly was ever spoken about Roswell, and it was forgotten, even forgotten by ufologists. But of course, post-70s onwards, a lot of people started looking into it, and today there have been dozens of books published on Roswell. And the Air Force in 1994 launched an investigation into Roswell. And the reason why they did that is because the congressman at the time for New Mexico, Stephen Schiff, he had a deep interest in Roswell, and he approached what at the time was called the General Accounting Office. Today it's called the Government Accountability Office. And he asked them to look into Roswell. Now the GAO is a very powerful organisation, and they look into issues like, for example, the Congressman Schiff wanted looking into. And they can sort of literally go into agencies and say, we want you to hand over to us any files that you might have on Project A, Project B, Project C, etc., etc. And the order went out from the GAO to the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Atomic Energy Commission, the FBI, the CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, the NSA and the Pentagon. Everybody that conceivably might have known something about Roswell was ordered to look into their archives and see if they could find anything. Nobody could find anything at all, no records. The only agency that came up with anything was the FBI, and they found just 2 pieces of documentation, each 1 page long, which essentially paraphrased the original press release that the military put out. So it didn't really reveal anything new. But when Congressman Schiff asked the GAO to get involved, this kind of took things to a completely different level. And what happened was that the GAO prepared its reports, but at the same time, the Air Force decided to launch its own investigation into what happened at Roswell. And the conclusion of the Air Force was that, well, it wasn't a flying disc, but it actually wasn't a weather balloon. They backtracked on their official statements that it was a flying disc, and then they backtracked on that it was a weather balloon. What they said it was called a mogul balloon, M-O-G-U-L. And mogul balloons, it was a legitimate project in the late 40s in New Mexico, and it involved these gigantic balloons that were secretly released high into the sky. And they were designed, they had sort of monitoring devices on board. They were designed to monitor for early Soviet atomic bomb detonations. And so it was a classified program. But the problem is that the mogul balloons, there was nothing special or out of the ordinary about the balloons. What they were just normal weather balloons all strung together into literally like a 500 long foot train of balloons with these sensors attached to them at varying levels along the line of balloons. So there was nothing, as I said, nothing out of the ordinary about the materials. It was just a lot of balloons strung together. Now, in that report, the Air Force said, well, we haven't addressed the bodies issue because mogul balloons didn't carry people, so there couldn't have been any bodies at Roswell, which is kind of like an unusual bit of logic, really. But then in 1997, the Air Force changed its opinion again. They published another report just on the bodies and said, well, we've gone back into the files and we think there were bodies after all, but they weren't aliens and they weren't people. They were crash test dummies used in parachute experiments. Now, ironically, the guy who ran the parachute experiments with these crash test dummies confirmed, and the documentation confirms, that those experiments didn't begin until 1952. And the official explanation for that was what became known as time compression, the idea of people mistook 1947 for 1952. And even the mainstream media that was in the audience at the press release, when they had the press conference, I should say, in the Pentagon, a lot of questions were asked, well, how do you reconcile that with the bodies or the crash test dummies having come down in 47 when the program didn't begin till early 50s, and that's when they came up with this time compression angle. And other people asked, one journalist asked, well, these crash test dummies are sort of, the same height as me, because what they were constructed to sort of be the regular weight of somebody in the military, and they would put their uniform on them, and they would throw the crash test dummies out of the plane to see how good the new parachutes would work. So they wanted them to look like the average soldier, or airman. And so people said, well, how do you explain the fact that the bodies were so small, sort of 4 to 5 feet tall? And the explanation was, well, when they hit the desert floor at such speed, the legs snapped off at the knees. So they kind of look smaller if you pick it up and stand it up. So, which is kind of, again, like an interesting explanation, which probably most people hadn't thought of. So in other words, you can see why some people have been suspicious of the fact that even from the government there have been no less than 4 explanations. The flying disc, which was the original one, the weather balloon, the mogul balloon, and then no bodies to crash test dummies. So, that's one of the things that intrigues people about this whole case, is the ever-changing stories. Now, outside of the government, there are other theories as well. For example, the one that I kind of like the most, which unfortunately I don't think it's a real answer, but it'd be kind of cool if it was, is like the time travel angle. And the theory is that, perhaps 500 years from now, archaeologists and historians really want to know what happened at Roswell. So they build a time machine, come back to 1947, they know exactly where the crash happened, and they insert all the coordinates so they can get to the crash site. And when they actually make it there, their time machine malfunctions and crashes, and they end up being the dead aliens from the Roswell crash, when they're actually us from the future. But it's kind of like a spiralling thing, what came first, the crash, or the guys going back to look into the crash. Those are some of the strange kind of paradoxes you have with time travel, but it would kind of make a cool movie, I guess, you know. But other theories are like a Russian spy plane. You also have, excuse me, you also have the theory that it was some sort of ancient human civilization. There are some researchers who believe that, you know, our species, Homo sapiens, we're not the first civilization, if you like, to rule the planet. There are a lot of stories about places like Atlantis and, you know, these ancient lands from thousands of years ago. So a number of researchers have suggested, could it have been something flown by an ancient race of humans of some kind that lived deep underground, deep in the planet? And one person who's spoken about this is a man named Walter Bosley. Walter has an intelligence background, and his father was in the Air Force. And his father told Walter that he was briefed on this theory, the idea that it could have been ancient humanoids rather than extraterrestrials. So in other words, a lot of different and unusual theories to try and explain what happened at Roswell. But everybody, whether skeptic, debunker, believer, everybody accepts that something came down. But the lack of paperwork is like sort of the most frustrating thing when it comes to actually answering the question of what did happen. Can we get the next picture? Now, that's a place called Oak Ridge, and Oak Ridge has a long history. It's based in Tennessee, and it's an atomic energy installation that back in the 1940s, when the atomic bomb was being developed, Oak Ridge was deeply involved in certain aspects of developing the atomic bomb. And so, you know, it was a very secretive, highly classified, well-protected installation. And in the early 1950s, there were a number of, not a lot, but there were a number of UFO sightings made over Oak Ridge. And in 1998, I wrote a book called The FBI Files, which looked at all the FBI's declassified UFO files, which had surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act. And I came across the Oak Ridge files in these FBI records, and I included a chapter in the book and titled it The Oak Ridge Invasion. And as very often happens if you write a book, if people know something about it, you know, they contact you. And that's what happened with this book and in relation to the chapter I wrote on Oak Ridge. And I, courtesy of care of the publisher, Simon & Schuster, what happened was that they sent me a letter which had been sent to Simon & Schuster in London, England, from the United States, specifically California, from an elderly lady who said words to the effect of, I read your book, and I liked particularly the Oak Ridge chapter because I worked there from 45 till 53, I think it was. And bear in mind, you know, 1998 was when not too many people really were on the internet, and this elderly lady, you know, wasn't on the internet, and most people who were on the internet, you know, everybody was on AOL, and it was dial-up and kind of very, very primitive compared to today. And so I actually wrote back to her. I said, you know, well, could you explain a little bit to me what you want to talk about? And she wrote back and said, well, no, not really. I don't really want to put anything down on paper. I said, well, could I telephone, you know, because I was living in England then. I moved over here about just under 20 years ago. And she said, well, no, I don't want to talk about it on the phone either. I said, well, what about fax? No. so I said, well, okay. Well, maybe one day we can meet in person. And it so happened that in the summer of 2001, I got invited to do sort of a tour of the West Coast. And it actually started, funnily enough, here in Roswell, and then sort of went up LA, San Diego, LA, San Francisco, then sort of curved round to Nevada, and then back to Dallas where I live. And so this was a perfect time to chat with this woman. And I explained to her, I said, look, I'm going to be over, actually in California, and she was living in Los Angeles. And so we had a chat, and I assumed, as it turned out incorrectly, that she wanted to talk about the UFO sightings at Oak Ridge, but she didn't. She wanted to talk about something that arguably was even more controversial and sinister than the UFO angle. And her son-in-law brought her along, and we had lunch at a Denny's, and both of them were kind of, you could tell from their body language, you know, they were concerned and worried about not just the subject, but should they even be talking about, or should she even just be talking about it at all? And bear in mind this was 2001, and she was talking about things from the mid to late 40s onwards. You know, the sort of fear in her would be on the level that if this had just happened yesterday, you know, she was talking about something yesterday or last week, that's how sort of the fear and concern and worry and paranoia that she developed, understandably, how it had kind of affected her. So we sat down and I said, well, can I record it? No. So I had to sort of get a notebook, pad out, and just make a bunch of notes from what she had to tell me. Now, I said, well, she said, you're welcome to use the story, but I don't want my name using. And that's one of the unfortunate parts of this particular story, at least in relation to this particular witness. You know, as someone who writes, still to this day, for regular newspapers and magazines, it's never a good thing, really, to rely on anonymous sources, because even if they're highly credible, even I can understand why they'll say, well, we can't speak to them. But sometimes, just because you're speaking to someone off the record who doesn't want their name released, it doesn't mean the story isn't genuine or credible. I mean, a perfect example would be Watergate, when President Nixon was forced to resign, and practically all of the incriminating data came from a source known as Deep Throat, and his name wasn't revealed until about 10, 11 years ago. That was back in the 70s. But it was that anonymous data with an alias for a name that pretty much ended President Nixon's presidency. And this was all through an anonymous source. So, you know, where possible, you know, if somebody asks me not to reveal their names, I don't. You know, I don't sort of say, no, I'm not going to, I'll withhold your name and then put it out. You know, that's the wrong way to do it. I respect it if people want their privacy. I get that. But the story she told me was one I was actually able to start validating. Now, this is where it gets into sort of really controversial areas. What she told me, she said basically that what came down at Roswell was not an alien spacecraft or time travelers or anything interdimensional. She referred me to, I should say, a series of high altitude balloon-based experiments involving people, sort of guinea pig situations. And yeah, sort of bearing in mind the time frame, 1945, 46, 47, this was sort of, you know, the immediate and afterwards post-war era, and when a lot of strange technology and science was being expanded upon. Now we could sort of beat the Germans, you know, we could sort of calm down and get back to living normal lives. And she told me how a number of these tests, if you like, which occurred in New Mexico, involved these gigantic balloons being lifted high into the sky. And bear in mind, this was 10 years before the space race began, the space program. It was in 1957 that the Russians launched their Sputnik satellite, which was the first man-made object in space. But this is back in 47, 46, 47. And she told me that there was these experiments being undertaken in various installations in New Mexico involving these gigantic balloons which would go high into the atmosphere and to the very fringes of what's called the stratosphere, which is almost sort of the fringes of the Earth's atmosphere itself. Now back then, 46, 47, nobody really knew what the full effects of high altitude exposure to things like cosmic rays, just high altitude exposure itself, oxygen deprivation, so they needed ways to find out. And we know for sure, again through the Freedom of Information Act, that in some of these balloon flights that there were mice and rats on board, and then they got moved to bigger animals like monkeys and then chimpanzees. And there's even a few stories which haven't been confirmed, with kind of strange stories of pigs being loaded into balloon gondolas and sent up into the upper stratosphere. But what she told me was that the time came when these groups essentially said, look, you know, we need to take things to the next level. We need people on board. It's all very well doing experiments with animals, but they're not going to replicate the same effects that high altitude exposure, cosmic ray exposure, oxygen deprivation. It would be different in animals to what it would be to people. And of course then the big question is, well, who's going to go on these flights? And the first idea was, well, will guys volunteer? Will the military volunteer? The concern was, because a lot of these earlier flights had ended badly, and we're talking about new advances in science. Again, the last thing they wanted to do was for this to fall into the hands of the Russians. And they felt, quite possibly, if there were 7 or 8, 9 or 10 guys from a military base in New Mexico that all volunteered, and they were killed, then the families are going to want to know what happened. And the newspapers would probably pick up on it, secret experiments, etc., involving the troops. And again, it might not be long before the Russians would find out, because when the first atomic bomb was dropped in New Mexico, or tested in New Mexico, I should say, New Mexico was soon swarming with Russian spies. So it was, it was a hotbed of Soviet espionage. So, in other words, the last thing that they wanted was for the Russians to sort of look into this. So they chose not to use military people. And this is where it gets really controversial. What she told me was that they had 2 options. One was to clandestinely go out to US prisons, speak with the governors, and literally ask the governor, this is going to be for US national security, it'll be part of making America safe. If you have prisoners here, low-grade prisoners who committed a crime, and maybe they're in prison for 2 or 3 years, or 5, 10 years, or however many years, and if they will do a deal, they'll take part in these experiments, and they get back successfully, the jail sentence is wiped out. Everybody signs like non-disclosures, everybody walks away, and it's never mentioned again. Now, that aspect is actually, those documents have actually been released through the Freedom of Information Act. They aren't questionable documents or potentially hoax. You can go to the National Archives in Maryland and read the files where they actually talk about, would it be legal to go to prisons and actually try and do a deal where people would take part in these experiments. So, but again, it was the early Cold War that the Russians were going to be the next enemy, and when you're facing the potential of nuclear war, having just finished one war against the Germans, it's a case of sometimes things are done in the name of national security and protecting the public, etc. And the other thing she told me was, which is even more controversial, she said that some were people who were taken from hospitals. And bear in mind, back then, the 40s, there was a lot of stigma concerning physical handicaps and psychological conditions. Very often, all around the world, people didn't want to deal with it, and children and families, were split up, and, somebody severely physically handicapped might spend their days just in a hospital. The family wouldn't talk about it, that kind of thing. And she said that a number of the people who were placed on these flights, again, were people taken from hospitals, which sounds, again, very dark and disturbing. Now, what she told me was that some of the people who were involved in these experiments were actually their bodies were taken because the flights didn't succeed. They all ended in disaster, pretty much. And one of them, she said, was the Roswell crash. And she said a number of these bodies were taken to Oak Ridge in sort of refrigeration units and then studied to try and figure out what had happened, what had gone wrong, or what the effects were on some of the survivors as well. And she said, although you might not find the Roswell files, she said if you dig deep, you might find some of the connected files that led to the Roswell event itself. So what I did, I spent a lot of time again at the National Archives and actually found some documents that supported what she said. Get the next one. Is this just not working, this one?
Should.
Oh, okay. Here we go. That's a woman named Edith Quimby. Oops, excuse me. That's a woman named Edith Quimby. And she was one of the pioneers of what's known as nuclear medicine. And it's basically, nuclear medicine is, today if somebody gets a serious form of cancer and you have chemotherapy or radiation therapy, very often what happens, the radiation can actually affect other parts of the body to the point where, you're curing one thing, but you're making the person, to a degree at least, sick in other ways. And it can be a very hazardous situation when you're trying to use radiation for a positive reason. And Edith Quimby, she wrote a paper in the summer of 1947 that dealt with radiation experiments on what were referred to as test subjects in relation to how radiation could have an effect on the thyroid gland. And test subjects is it's a sort of sinister term that was used back then. We're talking about people taken from hospitals, etc. And test subjects kind of sounds more like, I don't know if you'd even call an animal a test subject. It's kind of clinical and cold and just, not a good term. But to demonstrate the background to this, I'll read you an extract from Edith Quimby's report that talks about and I don't mean this disrespectfully, the people who were held at Oak Ridge and who did look, not like normal people, they had severe handicaps. Now, this is her exact quotes from her exact paper on what she called 54 test subjects. They were comprised of, quote, 15 who were between 1 and 4 years of age, 7 were controls, 2 were classic credins, 1 showed some features of hypothyroidism, 2 were dwarfs, 1 in the diagnosis was gargoylism, which is a condition which alters the face. 1 was suspected of progeria, a disorder associated with some of the features of hypothyroidism, and the last exhibited features of moderate sexual precocity. 27 were more than 4, but less than 15 years of age. Of these, 2 had unmistakable hypothyroidism, 2 Graves' disease, and 4 were dwarfs. So you had these people all held at this installation, Oak Ridge. Many of them dwarfs, others with various conditions, and some with a condition called progeria. Now, that's a real photo of a person with progeria. Progeria is an aging condition, and basically what it is, it's a condition that causes rapid aging. Most of the people who have progeria don't live much past 20, and by the time they are 20, their body physically is sort of in the condition of somebody who's 75, 80. And they look quite different as well. As you can see, there's an enlarged bald head. They actually don't have any body hair at all. And as you can see, the eyes are different. They have more, like a slight beaked nose. Their voice is different, it's sort of very high-pitched. And you can see with the shoulders as well, with us you have your neck and then your shoulders. With people with progeria, it kind of curves into one from the neck into the shoulders, as you can see. Now, she said that at least one of the people who was one of the guinea pigs on board this huge balloon flight that came down and that has become known as the Roswell incident, one of them was somebody who had progeria. Now, I can't prove that that is the case. That's an important thing to note that. That's why I say I don't force feed an answer down somebody's throat. This is a theory, like an ongoing investigation. We don't have proof. But then again, we don't have proof that a UFO crash, we don't have proof that a mobile balloon or crash test dummies came down. Or what we've got is testimonies, theories, and ideas. Now, if you had a person with progeria, say in a small, silver suit, lifted up into the high atmosphere, the object crashes, the body is left on the desert floor for a day or two, because by all accounts, when the military was looking for this device, because it was a nighttime flight, that the rancher, Matt Brazel, from the military's perspective, the worst case scenario happened was that the rancher got there first. Now, had the military got there first, then of course everything would have been scooped up. But if you imagine, a person with progeria probably badly damaged from the impact of the crash, left out on the desert floor for a day or two with the heat of the sun and the summer, possibly even, you know, animals, coyotes, who knows what. You could understand why even the military might turn up, military who weren't clear to know what was going on, and saw somebody like that, the remains of them. They might well think that what they were seeing was the remains of a UFO, flying disc as they were known back then, and the remains of a dead alien. And possibly over time, but not deliberately, it may well have been something along these lines that convinced people that what they were seeing were aliens that could have provoked the legend. Now, of course, it's not enough just to sort of rely on one person who tells this sort of highly controversial story of human experimentation and people with physical conditions that, you know, may have led to some of these stories. You know, you have to sort of look for additional data as well. Now, that is a 1995 book, which is about this thick. It's like about 1,200 pages. It's a US government report called Advisory Committee, Final Report, Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. And the Edith Quimby document I talked about is contained within this data collection file. And again, you can go to the National Archives and see the documents and the progeria photographs and things like that. So again, it's not hard evidence, but it's sort of a thread that sort of pushes things down that same path. Now, one of the most important aspects of the Roswell story is the issue of balloons. As I mentioned, one of the little-known aspects of the story is that the rancher, Matt Brazel, before the Roswell event, he'd already come across 2 military balloons on the property. Now, that is a Japanese balloon called a Fugo balloon, F-U-G-O, and during the second, or the latter stages of the Second World War, the Japanese launched these fairly large balloons. You can see there's like an image of a person standing there. They were large balloons, and they carried bombs too, and the idea was they would be launched from Japan, they would fly high into what's called the jet stream, and the jet stream would push them across the Pacific towards the US. And they were sort of calibrated that they would get lower and lower on their journey. And the plan was for them to sort of impact on US soil and the bombs would explode. Fortunately, there was only actually one case of any deaths in the United States. And this involved a family that found the remains in one particular area. And unfortunately, they started tinkering around with the bomb, not realising what it was. And I think it was either 6 or 7 were killed. But roughly 9,000 of these Fugo balloons were built and flown from Japan across the Pacific. But only literally in the hundreds was the number of balloons that actually made it to the United States. Now, the Fugo balloons were unmanned. But they were significantly sized, and thankfully they didn't do too much damage at all. And it was more like a sort of psychological weapon where the Japanese were trying to instill fear, in the American public. But what the FBI decided to do was to try and put a blanket silence on it all, and they asked newspapers if, don't give it too much publicity because we don't want the Japanese to know that some of these balloons have actually made it to US soil. So it was very much hidden. But what we know from some of the declassified files that have surfaced from the latter stages of the Second World War, had Japan not surrendered when the 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had they not surrendered, Japan had plans to build much bigger and much more sturdy balloons, which would actually have sort of gondolas beneath them with crews on board. And the Japanese even had a plan where beneath the balloons, which were going to be much bigger than these, there would be like a detachable glider type aircraft. And the plan was for these huge balloons to travel towards the United States. As they get to the west coast, the crew would detach the aircraft, the glider type aircraft, which would be loaded with bombs. And it would be like a kamikaze mission where they would just slam into cities. Now again, thankfully that didn't happen. But at the end of the Second World War, when Japan was defeated and surrendered, what happened was that a lot of the scientific files relating to these advanced balloon programs that the Japanese had were essentially captured by the US, again, because the worst case scenario was that if the Russians or a potential enemy got them first, they could have the upper hand. So what happened was that a lot of this material, the documentation, was brought over to the United States. And on top of that, there was a unit called Unit 731, which did all sorts of bizarre and terrible experimentation during the Second World War, much of it just really because they were kind of sadists, a lot of the people on the programme. But one of the areas that Unit 731 was working on was how the human body could be affected by high altitude exposure and oxygen deprivation. So again, a lot of the files on these issues, which are important to the sort of growing rocket program that's occurring in the US, the files from Unit 731 were also brought over to the United States. And then you had something that's known as Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip was a similar plan to the Japanese one, where when Hitler Hitler committed suicide, but when the Germans surrendered, a lot of the scientists, the rocket scientists, again were brought over to the United States under cover of this classified program called Operation Paperclip. And altogether, it was literally in the thousands, the number of people who were brought over, and most of them working in the field of rocketry, and particularly things like the V2 rocket, which was one of Hitler's sort of most feared devices, if you like. And again, this was, you have to look at the time frame as to why it's important. We'd just beaten one enemy, and now it was becoming clear that the Russians were going to potentially be the next enemy. And so it was a case of, well, we may not want to do a deal with a bunch of Nazis who we've just been fighting, but the alternative is we let them all fall into the hands of the Russians, and in worst case scenario, the Russians would then get the upper hand. And if they did, who knows what could have happened. We could have had a nuclear war in the 50s, and the world today would still be just destroyed. And sometimes, in warfare, that's what happens, awkward situations occur. But the paperclip scientists were brought over. That's one of the rockets that the Germans were working on at the time, the V2. That is, a lot of those were the original paperclip scientists who were brought over to Fort Bliss, Texas. And from there, they were sort of spread out to various other locations, some of them at White Sands in New Mexico, others at Alamogordo in New Mexico. And again, working on a lot of fringe, weird programs. And a lot of the paperclip program files, although a lot have now been declassified, there's still a massive amount that remain classified to this day. And that's in total, not, they haven't even been partially released, they're just totally still classified to this day. And what those files might tell us potentially about a Roswell connection, we don't know. But, it's intriguing to note that what we have is this post-war era of highly advanced Japanese balloons, German scientists, the human radiation experiments, the progeria files and photographs, all coming together, and much of it concentrated on New Mexico. And so, again, whether you buy into the human experimentation angle or not, we do see kind of like a scenario coming together when you start to put the pieces of the jigsaw together. Now, probably the most famous or infamous of all the German scientists brought over was Werner von Braun. That's von Braun in the middle with his suit on, and the rest you can see are all the Nazi cronies standing around him. And he was brought over because he was a brilliant rocket scientist. And again, there was a great deal of conflict within the military and the government as to whether or not, regardless of however clever they might be or the technology that they were working on, there was a great deal of sort of hand-wringing and, people looking at the moral angle of, should we actually doing a deal with these Nazi scientists, or should we let them fall into the hands of the Russians? No. But even when the scientists were brought over, a lot of people, understandably in the government, were not happy about it, and they felt it was almost, doing a deal with the devil because there was no other choice, in terms of national security. So, Von Braun, as you can say, surrounded by all his German Nazis, friends, whatever. That's him there, and that's him just a few years later with JFK, when he became part of the NASA space program, and he was one of the primary figures in the development and design of the Saturn V rocket that took the astronauts to the moon. So, he was integrated into the space program. And so again, you have this issue of space flight, radical and unusual aircraft and space vehicles, all backtracking to Operation Paperclip. Now, again, that's not enough to make a connection directly and say, well, we can say for sure that what came down at Roswell was some kind of hybrid Japanese, German technology, even though we know now that the photographs, and again, just to remind people, the photographs of the people with progeria who were the subject of radiation experiments at Oak Ridge, now the files are in the public domain, and we've got this, we've got the Japanese balloon, we've got Paperclip, but again, that's not enough to make a case. It's enough to make an intriguing scenario, so we need to sort of continue with the investigations. Now, in terms of the witnesses and the people who we know for sure were at Roswell, one of them was a guy named Melvin Brown. And Melvin Brown was a legitimate employee at the Roswell base in 1947. You can actually find him in the yearbook, the military yearbook. Now, he first told his family about what happened at Roswell and what he knew in 1969. And then when he was dying on his deathbed in the late 80s, he opened up a bit more. And he said, and that's a direct quote from him, that the bodies he saw could have passed for Chinese. Now, if you think about that, that doesn't kind of sound like the classic alien grey, as the aliens are known. These sort of little spindly creatures with a massive head and a black insect-like eyes. If you say something, a person could have passed for Chinese, well, that suggests they look Chinese or maybe Japanese. So again, we have this angle to the story as well, where contrary to what a lot of people might assume, even the witnesses who were there, some of them, like Melvin Brown, were not talking about something that looked non-human. They were talking about something that looked actually quite human. Now, that's a man named Dr. Lincoln La Paz, and he was an astronomer and someone who was a well-regarded source in New Mexico. And on top of that, he was someone who was consulted by the government on various programs over the years. Now, one of the people who I mentioned earlier in the lecture, who almost certainly knew the full story of Roswell, was Bill Ricketts, one of these intelligence officers, brought out to the ranch with Sheridan Cabot, and almost certainly saw the bodies. Now, Rickett was an unusual guy because he was interviewed by various UFO researchers in the 80s and 90s and was willing to admit that he was out there, and yes, they collected all this wreckage. But when the issue of bodies came up, he was like a deer caught in headlights. He just did not want to talk about it all, and he was very sort of cagey and cautious, even nervous and scared to bring up this issue or even respond to this issue of bodies. One of the things he did say, though, was that a couple of months after the Roswell events occurred, he was actually ordered to take Dr. La Paz out to the crash site area and to do some more field work to try and figure out the trajectory and speed of the object, whatever it was that came down. And as an astronomer and a scientist, a number of UFO researchers have suggested, well, that makes sense. They would bring somebody like the Paz in to investigate an alien spaceship from another world coming down. And, you know, you can make a valid argument that that actually is the case. But it's intriguing to note that there was actually another aspect to Paz's work, which was secret work during the Second World War. And we know this because in '45, when the secret was over, the University of New Mexico put out a press release talking about the Paz's Second World War research. And I'll tell you exactly what this press release says. Observers watching for meteors thought they had something when they saw brilliant lights in the sky from February to May 1945. And they did, said Dr. Lincoln Paz, Mathematics Department's head at the University of New Mexico and director of its Institute of Meteoritics today. The displays were actually made by Japanese balloons, Dr. Paz said, revealing the history of a scientific study of meteors which went on before and during the time that Dr. Paz was busy in, quote, secret government work of studying and combating the Japanese balloon offensive. So in other words, yes, Dr. Paz was an astronomer, a scientist, but he was also someone who in the Second World War was one of the major players in the US government's program to try and offset the effects of these Japanese balloons. And he studied the balloons, he was given access to the bombs and the coatings and everything else. So, in other words, we can make a connection in terms of Dr. Paz being one of the most primary leading figures in the investigation of the Japanese balloons, and then suddenly 2 months after Roswell, he's taken out to the crash site. So again, in a roundabout way, we have another Japanese/balloon connection to the Roswell affair itself. Can we do the next one? Try again. That's a man named Leonard Stringfield. Leonard Stringfield, between the late 70s and up to his death in 1994, he was probably the most famous collector of UFO crash stories. And even as much of a believer in the crashed UFO angle as Stringfield certainly was, he was also someone who wasn't sort of against publishing a few controversial stories as well. And he, back in 1991, said he was told the same story, namely of a Japanese human experiment angle connected to the Roswell affair itself. Again, they may have come from Japan. That's actually a statement that Stringfield quoted from one of his sources, talking about some of the bodies having been stored at this place, Los Alamos, in New Mexico. So, in other words, you know, we have this situation again where there are threads and leads that potentially at least push things down a human experiment angle. Now, in 1997, we had the 50th anniversary of the Roswell crash, and Popular Mechanics put out like a 50th anniversary of the Roswell issue. They ran an article titled Roswell at 50. One of the interesting things they talked about was the Japanese connection to Roswell, and I'll quote you, I'll read you a quote from exactly what the magazine said. Popular Mechanics has been told of a forthcoming release of documents scheduled and which will tell of a Japanese counterpart to Operation Paperclip. One of its purposes was to determine if the Japanese had constructed a suicide-piloted version of the Fugo incendiary bombs. And they continued that, in their opinion, what came down, based on sources who said these documents were going to surface, what came down was sort of a hybrid craft of a gigantic, sort of re-engineered, gigantic Japanese balloon array with this detachable glider-type aircraft. So it'd be like a hybrid device, which is what all of the people pretty much who've talked about this human angle of Roswell have suggested actually happened. Now, we don't know who Popular Mechanics' sources were, but they specifically did state that there was going to be a release of documents to support this. Now, that didn't happen. What did happen instead was, as I mentioned earlier, the crash test dummy report came out. So whether that was, whether there was some sort of degree of infighting within the Pentagon or somewhere, we don't know. But what they were told was going to come out was not released, and what was released was the story that the bodies were crash test dummies. So maybe, that there's a scenario possibly where even deep within the intelligence world, there could be, a clash of ideas as to whether or not the Roswell information should be released or whether it should remain withheld. Now, that's a man named Randall Lovelace, being decorated right there. And he was someone who, excuse me, was also a major player in NASA and also an expert in the field of high altitude exposure experimentation and the science and technology based around what became known as space medicine. Again, understanding how the human body might be significantly affected by high altitude flying, high in the atmosphere, stratosphere, and ultimately, when we left the atmosphere and went into space. There's an intriguing story that comes from a now deceased researcher named Kathy Caston. And Kathy, as far back as the early 1990s, was looking into this issue of could there have been a human angle to Roswell rather than an extraterrestrial angle to the case. And she dug very, very deeply into the story of Lovelace. And I know this because when I wrote a book back in 2005, the first book I wrote on this human experimentation angle called Body Snatchers in the Desert, she contacted me and said, I've been looking into this same theory for a number of years, and she had her same old-timers telling her stories in the same way that I did. And when she died, her family very kindly donated all their files to me. And it was literally a case that one day, just a few weeks after her death in 2012, there was a knock at the door from like UPS or FedEx, and there was literally these huge cardboard boxes filled with thousands and thousands of pages. And a number of them talked about how Kathy had spoken, like me, with old-timers who said there was this Japanese connection to Roswell, the high-altitude flights, the paperclip program, and from there, she was looking into this guy, Randall Lovelace, who was, I said at the time, based in Alamogordo, and was doing a lot of this groundbreaking research. And two of her sources said that when the crash happened on the ranch in Lincoln County, that the dead bodies of the crew, if you like, or the guinea pigs on board, the ones who were killed, were the bodies were hastily taken back to Roswell to try and perform some sort of emergency attempt to essentially prevent the bodies from decaying anymore and preserve them. Now, most people who, in the pro-Roswell UFO community, have talked about there being allegedly a surviving alien from the crash. Interestingly enough, Kathy's sources told her that yes, there was a survivor of a human casualty, and her sources said that he was taken to a place called Fort Stanton. Now, according to Kathy's sources, they said this was a deformed man who was on board this guinea pig flight. Now, Fort Stanton is, if I was to say it's within stone's throwing distance of the ranch where the object came down, I would be barely exaggerating. Fort Stanton from the crash site, the Roswell crash site, is no distance at all. I wouldn't say you can walk it, but I mean, you get the picture I'm making. What's interesting is that during the Second World War, when you had a lot of what were called detention camps, where, or detention installations, where a lot of Japanese people were held, because the war was going on, it wasn't long after Pearl Harbor. A lot of them were housed at Fort Stanton. On top of that, in 1946, it became a hospital for people suffering from tuberculosis, and also people with a lot of physical handicaps were also housed at Fort Stanton. And she dug into this more and more and came to believe that the Japanese connection, the handicap connection, all to Fort Stanton, which as I said is just literally down the road from where the crash occurred, that this was also kind of interconnected. Now, just jumping back to 1997, that guy there, sort of second left, is an old photograph of Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso. Now, Corso wrote what was without doubt the most controversial book on Roswell ever. And in terms of what the book says, it's so specific that it can only be 100% true or a 100% lie. There's no middle ground because he's so specific on what he says. According to Corso, after the Roswell event occurred and the aliens were found and the UFO, that he initiated or ran a program to understand and back engineer the technology. And he claimed that everything from night vision equipment, transistors, fiber optics, various other computer-based technologies were all derived from trying to understand and back engineer and replicate alien technology. And so that in essence is the story that he told, that he was the one guy more than anybody else that boosted the US technology by secretly and unknowingly to the companies inserting alien technology into our pre-existing programs to kind of give it like a kick-start. Now, as I said, because he specifically talks about names, places, technologies, who was working on these programs, as I said, it's either 100% true or 100% not true. And people have asked me, what's his motivation? If it's true, well, he just went to get the story out. Could there be another motivation for him wanting to promote the alien angle? Well, possibly there is. We know for sure that for a while, Corso worked on aspects of the paperclip program. That's a fact. And so he may have known of some of the scientists being brought over and some of the experimentation that went on. But more importantly is this guy, Major General Charles Willoughby. That's a picture of him when he was a young man. But he was a major figure in the military in the Second World War and onwards. And Major General Willoughby just happened to be one of Philip Corso's closest friends. On top of that, Charles Willoughby was the guy who oversaw the transfer of all the Japanese Unit 731 files and all the radical balloon designs over to the United States. So again, we've got this situation where we've got Corso talking about things from a UFO perspective, but then having deep ties to somebody involved in this whole Japanese, the balloon angle, the high altitude balloon experiments, etc., etc. Again, it's another thread to the story, and in terms of what it means, well, it's kind of like with the UFO story, or the UFO theory for it. We can go so far, but how much further can we go, trying to put these threads and leads together? One of the problems that we have when it comes to trying to figure out what actually happened is the sort of deep reluctance on the part of many to discuss what actually happened. And much of this does revolve around the issue of bodies, as I mentioned with like Bill Rickett and people like that. Now, as I said earlier in the early part of the lecture, in 1994, the Air Force put out a report on Roswell saying that what came down was a mogul balloon. Now, the report, the public report, was just a small one, about 30, 40 pages, something like that. That is the cover page of the full report, which is just under 1,000 pages or just over. That's my copy of it. If you put it sort of sideways on, it's literally like that thick. That doesn't just include the summary, it actually includes transcripts of all the interviews with the people that were involved in the case or could offer some sort of insight. One of the people I interviewed was another guy I mentioned earlier, Sheridan Cabot, and he was one of the intelligence guys who was out at the site. We know him for sure he was out at the site. Even the Air Force confirms that he was out at the site at the time. Now, the Air Force, when they put their report out, Sheridan Cabot was still alive. Of course, he was in his 80s and long retired. But the Air Force contacted him and said, look, we're looking into Roswell. We think it's what was called a mogul balloon, which are these giant balloons, and that would explain what you saw. one of the remains of one of these gigantic mobile balloons. And Cavett said, yeah, you can come out, So one of the Air Force investigators came out and essentially interviewed Cavett in his home, with Cavett's wife Mary sitting in on the interview as well. And when the Air Force basically asked Cavett, what did you see? Because we think it was a mobile balloon. Mobile balloons are these gigantic balloon arrays, which I said extended to sort of 500 to 600 feet. And even to the Air Force, Cavett said no. He said, what I saw extended to on the field, on the ranch, was no more than 20 feet in length. And that is actually, that quote is in that, the full report. So this left the Air Force in a bit of a quandary, because initially, Cavett, years before it all became public, did state, confirm what Jesse Marcel said, that regardless of where you think the wreckage was, it extended for like hundreds of feet across the ranch. But speaking to the Air Force in 1994, Cavett said, no, that's wrong. It was just a weather balloon. It wasn't a mobile balloon, it was a weather balloon, and it was just strewn across about 20 feet. And the Air Force investigator actually said, kind of like the size of your room, your living room, and he said yes. And that again is in the documents. Now, a lot of people who are proponents of the mobile balloon theory, this creates a problem, because you have Sheridan Cavett, who even the Air Force admits was on site, denying that it was a mobile balloon. He said he'd never even heard of mobile, and actually saying that no, it wasn't 600 foot or 500 foot worth of debris, it was 20 feet. So when it comes to the issue of trying to take things further, a case can be made that Cavett knew exactly what happened, but whoever he was answerable to was above the Air Force, and somebody wanted not just the public and the UFO community not to find out. They didn't want the Air Force to find out either. And there are indications that Cavett actually took to the grave with him what he knew. And he may have known, probably didn't know pretty much everything. For example, his family has since said that when he was on his deathbed and in pain, he actually refused pain medicine because he was fearful that with the pain meds his brain would be fogged and he might say something about what he knew, from way back in 47. And they confirmed that for that reason, he would not take pain medicine. So this kind of begs the question, if the Air Force is out of the loop, if the General Accounting Office couldn't find anything, if Congressman Schiff couldn't find anything, who is answerable? Where is the wreckage, or where are the original records? And that's where we hit this kind of stumbling block. And you might wonder for the final picture why I've got a picture of, what it actually is a picture of Jack the Ripper from an old 19th century newspaper. And you might wonder why I put a picture of Jack the Ripper up there. Well, it's because there's sort of parallels between Roswell and the story of Jack the Ripper, in the sense it's an old mystery. There's lots of different theories for what did or didn't happen, or who the killer was or wasn't. Different witnesses claiming this, different witnesses claiming that. But it's an old case, and now everybody's gone. And that's why there have been so many books on Jack the Ripper which present multiple theories, just like Roswell. Multiple theories, an old case, everybody's gone. And with Jack the Ripper, it's a mystery that's hit a brick wall. Roswell is a mystery that's hit a brick wall. And when I say it's hit a brick wall, I mean in terms of actually finding proof or evidence. Even the Air Force admitted they could not find any files to confirm that a mobile balloon came down. They just believed and concluded that's what it was. And as I said earlier, I don't believe the Air Force lied. A lot of UFO researchers believe that when the Air Force put out this report, it was a lie. I don't believe that at all. I think the Air Force felt obligated to come up with an answer when they were asked to look into it. And I think they felt the responsibility was on their part to do so. And when they found this theory for the mobile balloon, I think they truthfully thought that's what it was. They legitimately thought it was a mobile balloon. But I think there are flaws and holes in the mobile balloon scenario. But when you look into it, the fact that they had to interview Cavett, and Cavett wouldn't tell them the full story, that suggests the Air Force is out of the loop, because if both Cavett and the Air Force were in cahoots, there would be no need to interview him. And when Cabby actually said, well, no, it was just a weather balloon, the Air Force didn't really know what to do with that testimony because it didn't sit well with the mobile balloon scenario. So I don't think the Air Force were lying. What I think is that the Air Force in 1994 didn't know what happened, and they probably don't know now. But somebody knows, I think. But I think it's buried so deeply that, and possibly even literally so deeply, that we just cannot get our hands on the definitive answer. So I think for the future, Roswell's either going to go one of two ways. Either the story will surface because eventually somebody in government decides it's time to let people know what really happened, or maybe something could be declassified by mistake, and it could open the floodgates. Just even one little sentence, in a 60-year-old document might make a reference to Roswell, which could then open things further. Or the other possibility would be something like a ufological Edward Snowden. But there's regardless of what people think of Snowden, some people think he was a hero, some people think he was a traitor, other people somewhere in between. But the reason why he got so much material was because it was all digitised, And if you look back at Roswell, back in '47, it was paper and those funny old things known as typewriters, So it would be extremely easy to hide the Roswell files where they could never be accessed because nothing's on computer, nothing's on a flash drive, nothing's stored away electronically. So I think it could be, if Roswell was a human experiment, I think it's probably, the situation today is kind of like the final stages of the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie, if you've seen it, where the government recovers the Ark of the Covenant. And instead of investigating it, what they do, they just put it in this warehouse and leave it there. Now, if Roswell was a human experiment and not much was learned from these flights or experiments, and everything was seen as a waste of time, if you like, or a mistake, there would be no need, obviously, to keep the remains of shredded balloons. And arguably, there would be no point after the autopsies and studies of the bodies have been undertaken. There would be really no need to keep them. If it had been a UFO crash and dead aliens, all of that would have been preserved forever. But human experiments, the bodies, the wreckage would just have been destroyed. There would be no value in keeping it. And the files would be the only thing probably worth keeping for future reference. But if it literally is kept, out of our way, no one can access to it, only a small group of people know the secret, I truly don't know how we go further, whether or not we'll get the answers, or whether or not it will just fall into like Jack the Ripper territory. I hope it doesn't, but rather than being, somebody who, I'm not one of these people who say, disclosure's coming and, we're all going to get answers tomorrow. I can't say that. I'd be lying if I said to you that I think we're going to get the answers. I think if we get them, it's going to be either a hard road to get the answers, or something will surface in a very alternative, unforeseen way. And, and then we'll all know. Ironically, people ask me, what do I hope happened at Roswell? Well, I actually wish aliens did crash at Roswell because it would vindicate everything that we've done. But, I can only be honest with you and say, when I put all this together, paperclip, these Japanese balloons, the new design for balloons, the fact that we can prove that people with dwarfism and progeria were used in radiation experiments, not hearsay documents. And we look at the time frame, we look at the paperclip scientists, everything connected to New Mexico, people like Melvin Brown talking about the bodies he saw looking Chinese, Kathy Caston looking at Fort Stanton and the Japanese internees in detention. You put all those pieces together and we have what I believe and conclude is the bare bones of a very dark and sinister experiment that 70 years later still has to be hidden at all costs, purely and simply because none of the technology or even the history of paperclip, but because of the potential usage of people. I think that, in many respects, is more controversial in many ways than the idea that aliens crashed. It could be more of a motivation to hide it than even a UFO crash. So that's sort of the background and a very sort of diluted version of the entire story that I've uncovered. But if anybody's got any questions, we've got a 30-minute break. If everybody's got any questions, we can do questions. Or if everybody's starving and you want to grab something to eat, I won't hold it against you. Thanks a lot.